the John Birch Society that helped fund this event speak and introduce Dr. Coffman.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. And by the way, I am not Steve Shirtliff, but I am a fifth cousin. So a few people RSVP thinking I'm Steve Shirtliff, and I've never met the gentleman, but we hope to meet sometime. Anyway, there's a package that some of you picked up that all of you state reps should complimentary. You have a DVD, a 20-minute DVD on the subject of Agenda 21. It's also on the YouTube. We have a reprint from the February 2011 New American, a little pamphlet, and a little booklet on the subject of Agenda 21. Those are for you. Now, Dr. Coffman has a book table manned by his lovely wife, and he's authored numerous things, and these are various prices, including this book that just came out, Plundered, yes, the book Plundered. And by the way, I've known Dr. Coffman, I think since 1994, 95, and in 1997 he authored this article in the New American magazine. So this is an issue that is not new to Dr. Coffman or to us. But let me read you his quick biographical sketch, and you can come right on up. And oh, by the way, if you RSVP'd, you have a lunch. If you didn't, there may be enough, hopefully, if we get some no-shows, but we'll do the best we can. Anyway, Dr. Michael Coffman has a PhD in ecosystems and climatology. He has led a multi-million-dollar research effort in global warming and has been able to stop the ratification of the Convention of Biological Diversity in the U.S. Senate 1 hour before the cloture vote was scheduled. And some of you have seen that map. That's his creation, and they have copies of that map on the table here, the biodiversity map. He has produced over 10 DVDs, the most recent being Global Warming, Emerging Science and Understanding. He has also written 5 books, the latest before Plundered, being Rescuing a Broken America. And by the way, I think his best book, not available here, is Saviors of the Earth. It's a history of the environmental movement, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's available on Amazon. I highly recommend it. It goes back to the 1800s. I think I've seen them as low as a penny a piece, plus shipping. So again, I highly recommend that. He has worked tirelessly on exposing the global agenda in its effort to create global governance around what is called the United Nations Agenda 21 and its U.S. counterpart, Sustainable America. Let's give him a nice warm hand.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you're able to make it today. I know how busy you are, and I hope to have you out of here no later than 1 o'clock. Now, we may stay a little bit later for those who want to hear some information on global warming. I'm going to try to get through one of the Agenda 21 subcategories, which is the biodiversity issue, because it does affect New Hampshire tremendously. As well as, if we have time, I'll get into global warming. If we don't, if you have to leave, I certainly understand. Don't hesitate in getting up and leaving in the middle of the talk. So, again, one of the things that I've just done is publish this book called Plundered: How Progressive Ideology is Destroying America. I'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation. Most of what I'll be talking about, however, is Agenda 21, which is basically a progressive idea. Today, what I'll be focusing on specifically is private property rights. In order to understand Agenda 21, we have to understand the importance of private property rights. They're critically, absolutely, imperatively important, and we're destroying them right and left. Next, I'll be talking about the IUCN, Agenda 21, and Sustainable America. They're all linked together. I'll show you how they're linked and how we're actually implementing Agenda 21 and nobody knows about it. And then the last thing I will actually get through, for making sure that I get through, is smart growth. If I have time, I'll get into biological diversity and the global warming issue, which are all part of Agenda 21. Now, just as a very brief background, and this is very brief, but we have to put it in perspective, our Constitution basically is formed on the principles of John Locke and what he wrote back in the 1600s, where he said the purpose of government is to join together to unite for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estate. Does that sound familiar? Like it's almost coming right out of the Declaration of Independence? Well, Jefferson actually quoted John Locke in that particular document, which he calls by the general name property. The great and chief end, therefore, of men uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. This is a pretty strong statement. And remember, the Constitution is established on the writings of John Locke. And we have to understand how important private property rights really are, and I will get into that in a moment. Now, in the actual founders, you'll find writings like this. Now, James Madison isn't the only one that said something to this effect, where he said, "The government is instituted to protect property of every sort, as well as that which lies in the various rights of individuals, this being the end of government." The whole purpose of government should be to protect private property rights. We have drifted far from that. In fact, we're almost 180 degrees from that at this particular point. He says that this alone is a just government which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. Now, going on, as far as a definition of private property rights, I like this one of the best. It's written by the Washington Supreme Court Justice Richard Sanders, where he says that property in a thing, it consists not merely of its ownership and possession, but in the unrestricted right of use, enjoyment, and disposal. Anything which destroys any of the elements of property to that extent destroys the property itself. The substantial value of property lies in its use. If the right of use be denied, the value of the property is annihilated and the ownership is rendered a barren right. In other words, property rights that is stripped of any real value because of regulation is a barren right. It has no basis, and you might as well give it up. And many landowners and older property owners of various sorts find that restrictions on their use of their property, it could be land, it could be a lot of other things, is so restricted that they have no use now. But they still pay taxes. The Supreme Court said the Fifth Amendment guarantee was designed to bar government from forcing some people alone to bear public burdens which, in all fairness and justice, should be borne by the public as a whole. Almost all of our social kinds of restrictions, regulations, and so forth, being view sheds or whatever the case might be, falls under this definition. Is that certain people, because they have kept their land in a certain state, are now bearing the cost for the whole people because they want a view shed, for instance. And this is one of the things that the Supreme Court said really should never happen. That whatever ordinance, law, or whatever is passed has to be applied equally to all people. And when you start to pick out people because of what they have done and restrict their use of their property because of that, it's no longer constitutional. Of course, that has gone by the wayside now because of this decision. A taking may occur in any one of two ways. The governmental act may constitute a taking of it, first, if it does not substantially promote legitimate public interest. Well, a view shed is a public interest. Therefore, the Constitution now is thrown out the window, and we have restrictions because of regulations that prevent people from developing their land because it's a view shed, because it's a public interest. Or two, deprives the owner of any profitable use of the land. There have been cases in the past, and I won't get into them, but where you have basically a land tied up so much that a person cannot do it for anything other than maybe pitch a tent on it for overnight use or a campsite or something of that nature, and that's all they can use it for. When they bought it for millions of dollars because it may be on a beach, whatever the case might be. This is what has been used in recent years to justify almost any governmental action on almost any regulation to take someone's private property for public use. It should not be constitutional. Why is property rights so critically important? We get so focused on the public need for certain things that we forget about the fundamental purpose of private property rights and why they should be protected. Let me just give you an example. In 2010, the income for Americans was $47,200. $47,200. For the socialist Europeans, it was only $32,700. We're beginning to see the impact of regulations as we go down this list, the less private property rights that are guaranteed legally, the lower the gross domestic the gross domestic product for the nation, and therefore the per capita income. The former communist nations in 1992, they didn't have any private property rights. In 1992 it was $2,000. Today it's between $10,000 and $20,000, partially due to inflation. But they do have some private property rights that they didn't before. And in the third world, that still does not have private property rights. It's less than $10,000, anywhere down to $1,000 to $2,000 a year, because they don't have private property rights. Now, how do I know that? Well, our founders knew that. They could see it very clearly in what was going on in Europe. In England, you had the greatest British Empire in the world has ever seen, because they had private property rights right down to the average citizen. In France, it was a mess because they were still living under the feudal system. Fernando de Soto, in the early part of the 20th century, published this Mystery of Capital. He was funded by the World Bank to determine really what the effect of private property rights were. And he starts out by saying that 70% of all small businesses in the United States are started with equity loans on personal homes. Now, is that bank going to give you an equity loan if your private property rights are not guaranteed? If the government can come in at any time and take them away from you and the value plummet? The only reason that that happens is because it's guaranteed. That equity is there. Now, you may fail and the bank may collect on that equity on your home, but nonetheless, it provides capital necessary to start a business or to buy into a business. In developing nations, it takes 10 to 20 years to register property ownership and 100 bureaucratic steps, over 100. Every one of those bureaucratic steps, those bureaucrats want their cut. Why? Because corruption is the norm in those countries. And a person who tries to attain legally protected private property rights in these third world nations, they wind up paying 3 times as much in kickbacks as they do in the property in the first place. And it can take up to 20 years for that to happen. Well, if you buy the land at 50 years old, you're probably dead by the time you get those restrictions or those guarantees. So what we're seeing here basically is how critically important private property rights are to the foundation of the economy of this country. We don't see that. It's been totally denied to us because of our education system. Property rights, he says, are not legally established in these nations. It's called dead capital. It's there, but people never actually register it because it's too expensive and takes too long, if they can ever get it at all. And you're finding more and more in our regulatory system where you have to get permits, so many permits to go from one to do anything anymore, it can take up to 5 to 10 years. We're heading in the same direction as these third world nations are right now. De Soto estimates at that time, it was year 2000, that there was $9.3 trillion in dead capital worldwide. That's probably equivalent to close to $15 trillion today. That is equal at that time to all the capital in the 10 major stock exchanges in the world. Now that's impressive. In other words, their value out there exists, but they have no access to it because they have no legally protected private property rights. And it's 93 times more than all the foreign aid ever given, and 46 times all the loans ever given by the World Bank. What does that say? It basically says that if they had access to their equity value in their property because of legally protected private property rights, they wouldn't need foreign aid. They wouldn't need handouts. It's staggering, folks. It really is staggering how important private property rights are, and we have no clue. And we're doing everything we can as fast as we can to abolish them. If you actually plot all the nations in the world, the per capita gross domestic product, over an index of legal protected private property rights, you can argue about how it goes into that index, but they all come out about the same. 74% of the variation of the per capita gross domestic product is accounted for by whether or not they have private property rights. It's staggering. You will not find any other thing that comes even close to this graph right here as far as its importance in actually creating gross domestic product. Nothing. Now, that's how our country was founded. In fact, if you go back to that last graph, what you will find, even since this graph was created in 2005, we have gone from about position number 8, the 8th and most prosperous nation in the world, down to the 15th today. That's how fast we're actually dropping right out of the system. Because we're enforcing, we're more and more coming into the culture established what Jean-Jacques Rousseau established in the 1700s in his writings. He's known as the father of the French Revolution, modern European socialism, and communism. His students were George W. Hegel, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and others. This is the root of what we know as both socialism and communism today. And it's now prevalent in our system. He said that private property rights were designed by the rich to place new fetters on the poor and gave new powers to the rich. Now, why in the world would he say that? Because he lived in France. And as I said just a moment ago, France was still under the feudal system, where only the nobility and the Catholic Church can own property. And so what he saw as private property rights were giving more power to the nobility and to the Catholic Church. And so he was opposed to that, which irretrievably destroyed natural liberty and, for the advantage of a few ambitious individuals, subjected all mankind to perpetual labor, slavery, and wretchedness, because that's what the average French citizen was experiencing at the time. And he wrote many dissertations and so forth. The social contract was one of the most prominent that we're seeing today. In fact, President Obama has mentioned it several times. The fundamental aspect of the social contract is that the state, in relationship to its members, is master of all goods through the social contract, which within the state is the basis of all rights. They're called positive rights because the state controls your civil liberties. They're not unalienable as Locke portrayed them, as is written in our Constitution in the Declaration of Independence. But they're what the state gives you, and what the state gives you, the state can take away. Obama and the progressives today call this progressive ideology. This is what their whole premise is based upon. Frederick Bastiat, one of the first, after the Third French Revolution, it was a very bloody type of thing, and I'll get to that in a minute. But after that Third Revolution, back in the mid-1800s, what he saw was happening. He said this in a little book pamphlet called The Law, one of the most outstanding documents you want to ever see to understand what the law should be. But he said this, that socialists desire to set themselves above mankind in order to arrange, organize, and regulate it according to their fancy. Like Rousseau, they desire to force mankind docilely to bear this yoke of the public welfare that they have dreamed up in their own imaginations. What you will find that almost all of this is based in emotion, not fact. Tonight I'll go back into some of the historical documents to show that very clearly back in those days in the 1800s. Rousseau noted this, because it's based on emotion and because you have conflicting ideas, political questions will always be prejudicial, dominant, and all-absorbing. There will be fighting at the door of the legislative place, and the struggle within will be no less furious. Is there any need to offer proof that this odious perversion of the law is a perpetual source of hatred and discord that it tends to destroy society itself? Are we being destroyed?
Yep.
Our divisiveness in this country has reached a point where we're literally being pulled apart and destroyed. There is never in Congress, and I hope New Hampshire legislature is a little bit better, But in Congress, there is no hope of ever finding common ground because they're diametrically opposed. Let's talk about now the IUCN Agenda 21 and Sustainable America, because it's important that you understand this particular system of governance is based on what we just talked about, is government control of private property rights and of your civil liberties. The Earth Summit back in 1992 established Agenda 21. Agenda 21 has 40 chapters. Now, soft law, it doesn't have any legal teeth. You don't have to obey it. But this nation is obeying it, and I'll show you how in a moment. 40 chapters, it covers every aspect of our life. Now, many of you probably have never heard of Agenda 21. Why? Because it's being repressed in this country. Any knowledge of it? If you go on the internet, type in Agenda 21 in Google, you'll come up with over 300 million hits. It is prevalent across the world. It's being implemented everywhere. And we know nothing about it. Where did it come from? It's called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, otherwise known as the IUCN. You've never heard of that organization either. The purpose of the IUCN is back in the 1990s when nobody knew about it. They don't have it on their website anymore, but it says that to promote alternative models for sustainable communities and lifestyles. As a whole concept of sustainable development came out of the IUCN and Agenda 21. It's based in eco-spiritual practices and eco-spirit. What in the world is that? It's exactly what it says it is. It's based on their religion. Their religion that the earth is God and we need to bow down before it. It's astonishing. As Hal introduced me, he said of my book, Saviors of the Earth. That's pretty outdated now, it's 1994. But I go back into the history of the environmental movement. And it's astonishing. It's astonishing that the whole environmental movement at the leadership level, now not everyone is involved in this, please understand. But at the leadership level, it is a religion. And he goes on to say to accelerate our transition to a just and sustainable future. Humanity must undergo a radical change in its attitudes, its values, and its behavior. And when they say radical, they mean absolutely radical. Turning our society literally upside down as we're seeing actually happen before our eyes right now. In response to this situation, a new global ethics is taking form and is finding expression in international law. The Biodiversity Treaty, the Kyoto Protocol and climatology, all of these things that we're now facing have come out of this Agenda 21 and an international law. And it's all written by the IUCN. Now, what does sustainable development really mean? If you actually look at the public documentation, you'll find basically this: the sustainable development that meets needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, there's a problem with that. I'm not going to get into that, but at least you can generally accept that kind of a concept. But you don't want to do anything stupid today that's going to jeopardize future generations. Never mind that we're spending $1.1 to $1.2 trillion in deficits every year. This is the end game, written by a guy by the name of Stephen Rockefeller. Now, Stephen Rockefeller was the son of Nelson Rockefeller of the Rockefeller dynasty. He basically developed the entire concept of sustainable development, which led into Agenda 21, took it from back in the 1970s from the Club of Rome, brought it through the IUCN, and incorporated it into the legal documents that we see today in the coming out of the United Nations. He was in charge of every step. He says that sustainable by definition means not only indefinitely prolonged, but nourishing, as the earth is nourishing to life and the self-actualization of persons and communities. Now, if we had the time, I would take you into some of the other documentation where communities includes the rocks and soil and other such things too. It's just not living entities, it's actually unliving entities as well. The word development need not be restricted to economic activity, but can mean the evolution. Evolution is a sanitized word for reincarnation. I can't prove it to you right now, I just don't have the time, but understand that it means reincarnation. The unfolding, growth, and fulfillment of any and all aspects of life. And when he say any, that includes rocks, because they believe in reincarnation. Now, again, not all environmentalists, not all the people who are advancing this agenda believe this, understand that. But the money behind it is actually perpetuating this. Now, where does it come from? This is out of the President Clinton's President's Council on Sustainable Development. I'll get to it in a moment. But he says to begin translating the vision of Agenda 21 into U.S. action, President Clinton created the President's Council on Sustainable Development in June of 1993. This group of 25 industry, government, and non-government organizations, etc. Of the 25 members of the President's Council on Sustainable Development, 11 of them were also members of the IUCN. Are you beginning to see how they were able to get this into international policy, into U.S. policy without anyone even knowing about it? Now, at the same time, the Environmental Protection Agency said this, came out with an internal working document. This is not meant for public consumption. Natural Resources Environmental Agencies should develop a joint strategy to help the United States fulfill its existing international obligations. In other words, the Convention on Biological Diversity and Agenda 21. Now, Agenda 21 hadn't even been incorporated yet into U.S. policy, but this is what they go on to say. The executive branch should direct federal agencies to evaluate national policies in light of international policies and obligations to amend national policies to achieve international objectives. Not through Congress, but through the bureaucracy itself. In other words, they were creating U.S. policy within these various agencies without one word being said in Congress. Now, Agenda 21 came out in 1992. It actually was written about 10 years prior to that by the IUCN. It went through the President's Council on Sustainable Development, Clinton's, and they came out in 1996 with what's called Sustainable America. Sustainable America is the United States' response to Agenda 21 and how we're going to implement Agenda 21 in this country. In this, 7 sub-documents were written. Everything from sustainable agriculture to sustainable communities, right down to highways, energy, natural resources, and so forth. It covers every aspect of our society. But the most important, this wasn't something that was just written and put on the shelf. It was incorporated into every federal agency. And now, every federal agency, every federal grant that you get, or letters of understanding, a memorandum of understanding with the federal government, are linked back to Sustainable America and then to Agenda 21. Everything. And we've been doing this for over 10 years, almost 15 years now. And we knew nothing about it. And even the federal bureaucrats don't understand what they're doing. It's just federal policy as far as they're concerned. So don't blame them. Going on, it says, upon receiving the report, the President asked us to begin implementing our recommendations. One of the first things that they did was to go approach at the local and regional levels. The council worked in partnerships with federal government to support efforts of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National Association of Counties as they created the Joint Center for Sustainable Communities in 1996. So immediately, this agenda was pushed down at the local level through the county and through the city associations. And many of them grabbed a hold of it because there was a lot of federal money out there backing it up. The recommendations are comprehensive, addressing everything from economic and regulatory policy to natural resource management and so forth. It's very, very comprehensive. And everything that's coming out of this restricts the use of private property rights or abolishes it altogether. All of it. And that's the critical statement right there. If you understand that Agenda 21 cannot be implemented, or Sustainable America cannot be implemented without denying people their constitutionally protected private property rights, you've got a good grasp on what Agenda 21 does. And when you see bills coming across your desk in the legislature that look grand and glorious because it provides all these benefits and so forth to society, look below the lines and see if it denies people their private property rights because they have to give up certain of their private property rights in order for that to happen. And probably you'll see it almost every single time. And it's hurting us. It's killing us. It's killing our economy. We are plummeting in our economic wealth because our private property rights are being restricted. Finally, smart growth. How does this work out in smart growth? You have several major cities here in this country, in the state, as well as a lot of local towns and so forth are also doing this. Implementing smart growth or comprehensive planning. It promises basically to bring organization out of chaos. Supposedly, it's supposed to reduce traffic congestion. It provides a closer proximity to the workplace because you have to live near your workplace, you don't have to drive to it. Reduce air pollution because you're getting rid of automobiles. Increases affordable housing because you're making your housing smaller and more compact and so forth. And preserves open space and agricultural land because you deny people the opportunity of actually living in the country anymore. It's supposedly the smart thing to do. This is one of the earliest smart growth or comprehensive plan in the state, is the state of Oregon and the city of Portland. This is the urban growth boundary. What is there, if anything is in red or yellow, you can build at a very high cost, but you can build or develop. Anything in green, forget it. It's not going to happen. What happens is that you have what was once farmland now being zoned as commercial and developable. And that land went from about $10,000 an acre at the time to about $150,000 to $250,000 an acre overnight, as soon as the pencil was drawn. This is what it looks like from the air. The person on the left became a millionaire if he owned a farm. The person on the right is still trying to eke out a farm existence. And now he cannot sell his land for development to pay for his grandkids' college education or for his own retirement, his family's retirement. He's stuck with a piece of land that will never appreciate in value, other than inflated value. This is what smart growth and comprehensive planning does. Worse is that the planners themselves draw that pencil line as to where that boundary should be. Now, how often do you suppose that these planners will let their friends know where that line is going to be so that they can buy up some of this land cheap that's going to be developable and become extremely expensive overnight?
They're politicians, they would never do that.
Yeah, right. Right. That's what happens. The whole problem with smart growth and Agenda 21 is it just opens the door wide open to corruption. Every single time. They just came out with a report last year, for instance, and this is not on the subject, but I think it's important, is that this carbon trading plan in Europe, they came out and they found out that 95% of the carbon trading that was going on in Europe was corrupted. Because it's corruptible. That's the problem with this approach to governance. In fact, it's gotten so bad that they're about to abandon the whole concept of carbon planning in Europe. Okay, let me give you some economic examples. The mean family income for Portland remained relatively flat since they introduced this kind of comprehensive planning. But the real estate, real housing prices went up by 300%. Why? Because they've created an artificial shortage. And it happens every place that has been tried. In fact, the Harvard Institute of Economic Research did a study across the country with quite a few communities, and those communities or cities that still had average planning or average zoning, you know, commercial, residential, multiple house, that sort of thing. The average price remained roughly what it's been in real dollars at about $40,000. And again, this was 2001, so it's a little out of date now. But about $40,000 per quarter acre lot. That was pretty typical if you do real dollars back into time. But those who have actually implemented smart growth or comprehensive planning, they started to see it skyrocket. And they did a thorough analysis, and they attributed all of it because of the planning, and the elimination of private property rights. It's now in the state of San Francisco over $650,000 per quarter acre lot because they have no place to go. So if you have a house that was built in the 1930s, the land itself is probably worth far more than that house will ever be. And when somebody buys it, they rip it down and put in something new. So you lose all of the characters, the historical characteristics of the community that you're in. Now, the American Planning Association is probably one of the more responsible organizations for making this happen. They're a very powerful lobby group. They work across the states and so forth to try to get this stuff implemented. They have dozens of actual plans under this legislative guidebook where a community, a small town or whatever, can actually take a pre-written plan, a template, put in their name, and instantaneously they have comprehensive planning or smart growth. And every time it will restrict the individual's right to use their property as they see fit. Now, I'm not saying, never try to make me say that there shouldn't be limitations on private property rights, because there have always been limitations on private property rights for harm, nuisance, health, and other issues. When that happens, you have to restrict your rights. You can't throw your trash on your neighbor's lot. But nonetheless, these all are written in a way that destroy private property rights, every single one of them. Another one that is equally as bad as the International Council for the Local Environmental Initiatives, it's called ICLEI. Now, the American Planning Association is working under the guidance of the federal regulation